Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you play chess better. In today's video, we're going to look at the idea of critical moves. One of the most important issues in chess is how to use your clock. All serious chess games are played with a clock, and you're given so much time, and you have to allocate that time, and you want to allocate more time to critical moves, moves that could decide the game, than you would to moves that are not critical. For instance, if you're playing a Cole system and you're trying to figure out where to develop the bishop on e2 or d3, then taking the average amount of time that you would have for the game for that move is a waste of time because it's not that critical. Let's set up a position like that just for the fun of it. We'll go back d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, e3, e6. Okay, so let's say you don't know the book here and you're determining whether you want to play bishop e3 or bishop d2. If we ask the computer to evaluate that, let's bring the computer analysis up into the window. All right, so here we can see the computer likes c4, second best move, third best move. All right, now the key thing is here, look at the evaluation on the left side here. You can see the numbers are all very close. 0.54 for the top one, 0.52 for the next. They're changing as I speak, of course. 0.47, 0.45, but notice how close they are. The difference between the number 1 move and the number 5 move is only about 1/10 of a pawn. So you can see that bishop d3 and bishop e2 are both near the top to develop the bishop. But the difference between bishop d3 and bishop e2 is hanging in there at about less than 1/10 of a pawn. So if you're playing a 45-45 game and you have 2 minutes per move, you wouldn't take 2 minutes to decide where to put your bishop here. It's just not that important. It's not a critical move. So in this video, we'd like to talk about what is a critical move, and I'd like to start by reading let's push back the size of the board here. Let's start by reading what Lev Albert and Al Lawrence say about critical moves in their book Chess Rules of Thumb. So I'm going to read number 135. Recognize 5 characteristics of a critical position. Number 1, when the game changes from known theory into unknown theory, from opening to middle game, or from middle game to end game. Number 2, when any pieces are exchanged, especially queens. 3, when there's any change or possible change in the pawn structure, especially in the center. 4, when you have a tactical short-lived advantage which will disappear if not exploited now. And 5, when you see a move which seems to win, which is a really important one. We've talked about that already in earlier videos. When you see a move that seems to win, that's a critical move. Those are moves you always play very carefully. His next principle, number 136, is a critical position is one about which you should think long and hard. So I'm going to give you my own definition in this video. You just heard Lawrence and Albert's definition. So there's as far as I'm concerned, there's 2 types of critical positions. One is positions that are complicated. In complicated positions, it's very likely that the best move is a lot better than the second best move, which in turn may be a lot better than the third best move. You could have a position where your best move wins the game, your second best move draws the game, and your third best move would lose the game. So that's very, very critical. And you can see that if you ask the computer to show you the top moves like we do now. I could probably show you critical positions from almost every game ever played. I picked out one right here. Let's examine this one, number 178. Okay, so this is a position for one of my students, one of the games I played against the computer. And here the computer played against me knight to d3, threatening simply knight takes b2, winning a piece. All right, this is a fairly critical move. How I'm going to respond to that threat and what I want to do about it could make a giant difference. And there's a lot of interesting moves that White has in this position. We're not going to go over it today, but in this position, it's very critical that White find a good idea here, because not only is Black threatening knight takes b2, but he also has some threats to play bishop takes c3. So there's a lot of things going on in this position, and it's fairly complicated, and I took a fair amount of time from my move here as White. All right, so I think everybody agrees that complicated moves are likely critical moves. But what about non-complicated moves? How can non-complicated moves be critical moves, moves on which you have to be careful about what you do? What kind of strategic decisions would be that kind of thing? And that's what the rest of today's video is about. So let's go through some of those. We saw Albert's example on what they might be. I'm going to give you some of my own. All right, so in the next one, the question is, should I open the position or close it? Here, white could easily close the position. He could play e5 and let black play d5, or he can play d5 and let black play e5. Either way, black will close the position. Black would not open the position with his king in the middle. So white has a critical decision to make. Should I keep the position flexible like this, or should I try to close the position? A lot of my students, when they get to these positions, they go, I want more space. And they let black close the position. And that's actually a big mistake here. But this position isn't complicated. And if you ask the computer, is there a very large difference between the best move and the second best move, it would probably say no. But the decision to open or close the position, or at least keep it flexible versus closing the position, is a very important strategic decision. And if you make it wrong, then the rest of the game you're going to likely suffer for it. So this is an example of a non-complicated strategic critical decision. All right, let's go to the next one. Next one is, all right, this is trade queens or not. Black has just played queen to d8 and offered the trade of queens. So white has to determine if he would like to trade queens or not. Now, what was interesting about this game is my student was playing white, and he realized that trading queens was a bad idea. So the right idea here is to move the queen somewhere where it just guards the pawn on h4. For instance, play queen to g3. Now the h4 pawn would be guarded twice by the queen and the knight, and white would be threatening to play h5. White could also play queen to g4, but then after f5 things gets a little more complicated. So here white should just bring the queen back and guard the h-pawn, and then threaten to play h5 with a monster position, which would be pretty much winning. Now my student understood that he shouldn't trade queens here, but instead of moving his queen, he played a move like, I don't remember exactly what the move was, but it was something like rook to g2. Well, that's not, quote, trading queens, but it's allowing black to trade queens, and that's exactly what black did to stop the threat of h5. He played rook queen takes g5, and black ended up winning the endgame. If white had simply not traded queens, white would be winning the middle game with the threat of h5. So this was a critical decision for white. Even though it's not extremely complicated, the question is, do you trade queens or not? And if you don't, how do you not trade queens? And of course, the right way to not trade queens is to move your queen so black can't take your queen. And that would have won the game, and instead he allowed the trade of queens and he lost. So this was a critical decision. And, you know, you can see when you give it to the computer that it will be a fairly large value between allowing black to trade queens or if white moves the queen and keeps the queen on the board. Sometimes with these strategic decisions, you don't see the computer's evaluation jump. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. With the complicated positions, you almost always see it jump. But with these strategic decisions, sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. In this case, you would see it jump if you let black take your queen. All right, let's go to another critical decision that's not necessarily a complicated one. Examine. All right. In this decision, white has to decide, does he want to trade rooks or not? Okay, the general rule is you don't want to trade when you're losing, and here white's down a pawn. So white has a choice basically of doing nothing or offering the trade of rooks. And if he does trade rooks, can his king get up and get into these pawns first before black's king gets over there? Because if black king gets over there, as we saw in the video that I made yesterday of king and 5 pawns versus king and 4, here it would be king and 6 pawns against king and 5, but it would be pretty much exactly the same thing if white traded rooks. If black can get his king over there, it's just an easy win. Well, in this position, my friend who was playing white did not take a lot of time. What he should have done was basically do nothing and just play like rook to c2. Instead, he played rook d1 and he hand waved. He didn't analyze. He just said, I'll play rook d1 and my king can get to the queenside pawns first, and then I will be able to probably save the game. As it turned out, he didn't calculate it. It actually was a completely lost endgame after rook d1, rook takes d1, king takes d1, and black won easily. So this was a very critical decision as to whether he should go into a king and pawn endgame. Anytime you go into a king and pawn endgame, it's usually a very, very critical decision. And a lot of my students do this really fast without really trying to figure out what's going to happen in the king and pawn endgame. There's a famous principle that says, don't go into a king and pawn endgame unless you're sure to get what you want. If you're worse and you want to draw, then don't go into a king and pawn endgame unless you're sure it's a draw. If you're better and you want to win, don't go into a king and pawn endgame unless you're sure it's a win. So here, white wants a draw. He played rook to d1, and that's just completely lost. So another example of a critical decision. This one, do I go into a king and pawn endgame? Do I trade off when I'm losing? All right, let's do the next one. The next critical one is, okay, this is a question of when do you attack. Right now, white has a fairly undeveloped position. His rooks on f1 and a1 are doing nothing. The bishop on c1 is undeveloped. The queen on d1 is undeveloped. So he only has 3 pieces out. Black has both knights out. His bishop's on d7. His rook has moved to c8. The bishop has just retreated from d6 back to b8. And white thinks that maybe he should be able to play knight to g5 and queen h5. So this is a when do you attack question. If this works, then it's not too soon. If it doesn't work, then it's premature. So let's ask the computer about it. Let's again bring the evaluation of the computer into the window. So Mr. Computer, let's show the top 5 moves here for white. Okay, and the answer is knight g5 is a premature attack. We can see that knight to g5 is not in the top 5 moves. And we can also see it's not super critical if white plays a good developing move. We can see that the top 5 moves are all between 1.0 and about 0.85. So that's not a big criticality, but it also says that knight g5 is not the right idea. Let's play knight g5 and see what the evaluation does. Look, it drops all the way down to minus 0.3, minus 0.5. So it's critical that white continue his development here and that he plays something, like rook e1 or bishop e3. And it's critical he continue his development, but it's not really critical what move order he does. If he moves out his queen to b3, if he puts his rook on e1, if he puts his bishop on e3, these all give white a slight advantage, a nice advantage. If he goes for the attack with knight to g5, then that's really bad. So it's critical that he don't attack so soon here. The position doesn't call for it. All right, so this is an example of a strategic decision. Do I attack now or do I continue my development? Usually the right answer is going to be continue your development, and that's the right answer here, but it's not always the right answer. And let's bring the window back down. You can see how we're using the computer evaluation to help determine the criticality of the position. It really wasn't that critical what white does, as long as white continues his development. But as soon as white decides he's going to attack, that's a critical mistake. And if he's going to do that, he would really want to take some time and make sure it really works. Because if it doesn't work, then you're really, wasting time playing moves like knight to g5 when in fact those moves are making threats, but those threats are easily met. All right, let's go to our next example of a strategic decision. Okay, so this is the famous pointing rule. If all 4 center pawns are locked together against each other so that none of them can move, so that there's no legal moves, we're not even talking about backward pawns, we're talking about absolutely no legal moves, then the arrow points to where you put your hand across the two center pawns and the arrow points to where you want to attack. And we talked in the other video about the fact you can't really use this with anything except the D and the E pawns. It makes less and less sense as you go outside if you have locked pawns to use this pointing rule. It really only works if the D and E pawns, all four of them, are locked up against each other. Then you can use it. And this is an example from the French pawn structure. So this is where to attack. Well, it's fairly critical that black would attack on the queen side here and white would attack on the king side if these were the central pawns. Obviously, there's a lot more pieces on the board, but where to attack is a critical decision. And if you choose the wrong part of the board, that could be relatively disastrous. So where to attack is our next strategic critical decision. All right, let's go to the next one. All right, so another important question in chess is, where do you put your king? And generally you have three choices. You can castle king side, you can castle queen side, or you could leave your king in the middle. So here it's black's move, and the question is, what should black do? Should he castle on the king side? Should he castle on the queen side? Should he leave the king in the center? Well, it looks like with all these white pawns up on g5 and h5 and the attack already starting here, it might be a lot better just to castle queenside, even though black's kingside pawns haven't moved and black's queenside pawns have. Your king is not safe based on whether your pawns have moved. Your king is safe based on your opponent's ability to attack you. And here white's ability to attack on the king side seems a lot stronger than white's ability to attack on the queen side, where black has all his pieces. So even though going by pawn structure would seem to indicate that black's safer on the king side, that's not a very good indicator. The better indicator is go where your opponent can't get his pieces. So let's ask the computer, Mr. Computer, what's the top 5 moves here? Let's show them again. We'll bring them up. Okay, and there's no castles, so let's show a few more just for the fun of it. Top 10. Top 10 moves. So castle king side is hanging around 10th, but that's not very good. And it says black is about equal if he makes a knight move like knight de5 or knight ce5. And if he castles king side, it says white's ahead by at least a pawn. So castling king side is a mistake, but it doesn't have castling queen side either. So in this particular position, the computer, at least temporarily, wants to leave the black king in the middle till things are clarified a little bit more. So that would be the strategic thing. I was just playing over a game from a famous position in the Nahdorf. Let's look at that position. Let's pull this back. And the famous position, which I've played many times back when I was an active player, is e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, a6, bishop g5, e6, f4, bishop e7, queen f3, queen c7, castles, knight bd7, g4, b5, bishop f6, knight f6, g5, knight d7, f5. So for many years, and when I was playing, the main line was knight to c5, and the brown line, bishop takes g5 check, was considered the speculative second line. And in the article that I was reading, it said that here, the popular move these days is castles. Of course, this is needed a computer help on the analysis to figure out that castle's king side was a viable move here. And he says this has become very popular in the last few moves. In the last few years, it's become very popular. So castles here for black. Well, we could just tell by looking at this position that white's pawns are already up, just like in the previous one. So with the pawns up like that, it looks like castle's king side here is very, very dangerous. And it is dangerous. But it also turns out, if you know all the computer analysis, that it's a very reasonable move in this position. So here, even though castle king side is a critical decision, it also turns out to be, by computer analysis, okay. There's another position like that in the French. In the winnower, e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, bishop b4, e5, c5, a3, bishop takes, pawn takes, knight e7, queen g4. Again, when I was playing, the number one move here was to play queen to c7. And sometimes I would try to transpose with c takes d4 here. And castles kingside looked like suicide to do that. But once computer analysis came in, the computer said, oh, no, castling kingside is the best way to play this. And in fact, castles kingside is so successful here that the line queen g4 against the winnower is not nearly as popular as it used to be, just because of this move, which looked dangerous in the pre-computer days, has now been shown to be perfectly safe. So where you're going to put your king is a very important strategic decision. Okay, we got a couple more to go. Let's look at the next one. Okay, so here you have to adjust for the material on the board. White is up a rook for a knight, and he also has a pawn. So he's up the exchange and a pawn. And the question is, adjusting for material, can I pin that knight, and after black gets out of the pin, just take it and win the king and pawn endgame? And as you saw in our video, king and 5 pawns against king and 4, the answer is yes. So here, if you adjust for the material, you'll see that the easiest way to win the game is actually to play rook d3, king e5, rook takes, king takes, and now king d3 to stop king c4. And now black cannot make the f-pawn backward. He can't play g4. And that means white's going to win. White will win with the same kind of methods that we showed in that video yesterday. If you didn't see our video yesterday of king and 5 pawns against king and 4, it's a good video that shows you that when you're in these kind of positions, if you play it right, you should be able to always win. So here, it's a decision whether to do that. Now, if we change the position a little bit, let's say we put the pawn up on g5 so it can make the pawn backward, well, that would make it a lot harder. Then you might decide, well, maybe I'm not going to play rook d3, rook takes d5, if after king d3 he can play g4. So even one little thing could make a big difference, but you have to adjust for the material. Here, normally giving up the exchange would lose the game, but here, because we're up an extra pawn and it gets us into a king and pawn endgame, we just have to figure out if that king and pawn endgame is winning. So here it could be, it's a critical idea that you have to adjust for, the material on the board. And when you're way ahead, way behind, a lot of times when you trade and so on would be a big difference. So that could be really critical. If you play rook d3 and take the knight, and it turns out you're not winning, then you just threw away the game. So obviously you want to make sure it's really critical decision to decide to do something like that. All right, our next to last example is, do you get enough compensation for a sacrifice? So for instance here, black has just played b5, and white can get 2 pawns for a piece in several different ways. He could take twice on b5, or he could take twice on e6, and he could start each one with the bishop capture or with a knight capture. So for instance, he could play bishop takes, pawn takes, knight takes, and threaten d6 like that. Or he could play, knight takes, pawn takes, knight takes, and threaten knight like that. Or he could play bishop takes, pawn takes, knight takes, and blast open the king and stop the black king from castling. Or he could play knight takes, and now black has a choice of which piece he wants to take. But let's say he takes the knight for sake of argument. Bishop takes, something like this. So white has to decide in all these cases. He's only getting 2 pawns for a piece, but he's getting some attack in some of these lines, and he has to figure out if he gets enough. So when you're sacrificing material, even if the game's not that complicated and it's going to be long-term compensation, you still need to take quite a bit of time to make a move like this. You wouldn't make it fast because you're tremendously affecting the balance of the game when you make a decision like this. So deciding to sacrifice a piece here would be a very critical decision. All right, our last example. Okay, so here white is in a passive endgame. Black's rook is more active. Black's rook is attacking the pawn, and white's rook is the one defending it. And white has to decide if he's going to just sit here and do nothing, or maybe he should just sacrifice his A pawn and get his rook into the game. Well, it looks like sacrificing that A pawn is suicide, and getting the rook into the game is silly, and that white should just kind of hang on here. But let's let the computer play both sides here. Let's say white tries to keep doing nothing. Rook to B2. Computer says black should play H5. White should take. Black should take. And again, white could move the rook up and give up the pawn. But let's say he doesn't want to do that. He just wants to sit here and do nothing. So black says, okay, if you're going to do nothing, I will come down. And white says, yeah, I'm going to just sit here and do nothing and get my draw. Black brings his king up. White moves his rook over. Black decides to push his pawn. Let's say white keeps doing nothing. Black pushes the pawn. White does nothing. Black gets his rook out of the way. White keeps doing nothing. Black gets the rook out of the way. White waits. And here black plays rook c1, rook here, rook b2, and then rook b1, and then all of a sudden rook b2 is a winning threat. Because if white just puts his rook over here to f2, black will just play rook takes h3 and win the game. So it turns out if white does absolutely nothing here, he can lose this position. So the computer actually wants to sacrifice this pawn and play rook to c4 and then cut off this pawn and stop these pawns from moving with an active rook. And the computer seems to think that if white plays actively this way, that he should be able to get a draw. So this is a very, very important decision. Do I sit back and play passively and just defend, or do I sacrifice a pawn and get an active rook and try to defend down a pawn with an active rook instead? This is a very hard decision. As a master, I get this decision wrong sometimes myself. You hate to give up that pawn, and a lot of times, if you do, you just lose the game. But a lot of times you can't draw by just doing nothing. So you have to figure that out. And it's not easy, so it's a critical decision. And right away, it doesn't look like it's a big deal. But if white waits too long to activate the rook until he realizes, oh my goodness, I'm going to lose something, then it may be too late. So figuring it out right now is a critical decision. So I call this whole idea of figuring out the criticality assessment. Criticality assessment is a cousin to time management. Time management is a very important part of chess. And the criticality assessment of the position, which helps you figure out when you're going to allocate time to which moves, which I call micro time management. These are important issues in becoming a good player. Good players know when to spend their time and how to allocate it, and a lot of that is their criticality assessment. Hopefully you enjoyed today's video and you learned a lot. For my YouTube series, if you enjoy it, you can subscribe. I think I've got about 20 out there now and growing. Okay, we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.